I was in my second year of college, and I had finally secured a single room in the dorms. No more annoying roommates, no more sharing a bathroom with 3 other girls. I was thrilled. The room was small but cozy, and it was mine. That first night, I unpacked my things, set up my desk, and tried to settle in. I had a lot on my mind. Classes, assignments, the usual stress of college life, but something about being alone in that room made it all seem a little more manageable. It wasn't until the second week that things started to get strange. It was little things at first. I'd come back from class to find my door slightly ajar, even though I was sure I had locked it. Or I'd notice items on my desk moved just an inch or two from where I'd left them. I figured I was just being paranoid. Maybe the maintenance crew had come in to check something, or maybe I was just too stressed and wasn't paying attention. But then, it got worse. One night I woke up around 2 a.m. thirsty and groggy. As I reached for the water bottle on my nightstand, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. My desk chair was pulled out, facing my bed, and there was a faint indent in the cushion, like someone had been sitting there. I was sure I hadn't left it like that. I always pushed the chair in before going to bed. My heart was pounding in my chest, but I tried to calm myself down. Maybe I had just forgotten. Maybe I'd gotten up in the middle of the night and didn't remember. The next night, I made sure to push the chair in, even double-checking before I went to sleep. But when I woke up again in the middle of the night, the chair was out, facing my bed, just like before. This time, I didn't hesitate. I jumped out of bed, turned on every light in the room, and checked every corner, every closet. There was nothing. No one. The door was still locked from the inside. I sat down on the bed, feeling the weight of the silence pressing in on me. I wasn't imagining this. Something was wrong. The next day, I went to campus security. I told them someone had been getting into my room, that things were being moved around while I slept. They were polite, but I could tell they didn't believe me. They checked the lock, said it was fine, and suggested I might be leaving the door unlocked by accident. They even offered to change the lock, which I agreed to, but I knew that wasn't going to fix the problem. I started to lose sleep. Every little noise in the night would jolt me awake, and I'd lie there in the dark, listening, waiting for something to happen, but nothing ever did. At least nothing I could see. The chair kept moving, no matter what I did, and every morning I'd wake up more tired, more paranoid. I started skipping classes, too afraid to leave my room, too afraid to stay in it. One night I decided to stay up and catch whoever or whatever was doing this. I sat in bed, my eyes fixed on the chair, waiting. The hours dragged on, and the only sound was the ticking of the clock on my wall. 1 a.m., 2 a.m., 3 a.m. I was so tired my eyes were burning, but I forced myself to stay awake. And then, just as I was about to give up, I heard it, a faint click, like the sound of a lock turning. My heart leapt into my throat, and I held my breath, listening. The door didn't open, but I could feel something was in the room with me. The air felt heavier, charged with a tension that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I wanted to turn on the light to see what was there, but I was frozen, too scared to move. Then, slowly, I heard the sound of the chair sliding across the floor, scraping softly against the wood. It stopped, facing my bed, just like before. My heart was pounding so loud I thought it might burst out of my chest. I couldn't take it anymore. I bolted out of bed, grabbed my phone, and ran out of the room without looking back. I didn't stop until I was in the lobby, gasping for breath, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold my phone. I called campus security, begging them to come right away. They found me there, still in my pajamas, crying and shaking, unable to explain what had happened. They searched my room again, but there was no sign of anyone else, no sign of forced entry. They tried to reassure me, but I could see the doubt in their eyes. To them, I was just another stressed-out student, cracking under the pressure. But I knew what I had felt, what I had heard. Something was in that room with me, and it wasn't going to stop. I moved out the next day, finding a place off campus with a friend. I didn't tell anyone the full story. What was the point? No one would believe me. But I'll never forget those nights in that room, the sound of the chair moving on its own, the feeling of being watched, of not being alone. And sometimes, when I'm alone in my new place, I still hear that faint click, like a lock turning, and I wonder if it's followed me, if it's still out there, waiting for me to let my guard down. I don't think I'll ever feel truly safe again. Story 2. When I first got to college, I expected a fresh start, new friends, and endless freedom. But what I didn't expect was to find myself in the middle of a mystery that would haunt me for the rest of my life. You see, it all started with a dare. My roommate Jake and I were always looking for a thrill, something to shake up the monotony of lectures and late-night study sessions. One night, after a few too many drinks at a party, Jake suggested we explore the old science building on campus. It was set to be demolished in a few weeks, and everyone knew it had been abandoned for years. The place was off limits, but that only made it more enticing. We gathered a small group, just 5 of us, all looking for a bit of adventure. We waited until after midnight, when the campus was quiet, and made our way to the building. The doors were chained shut, but Jake, always resourceful, found a way in through a broken window in the basement. The moment we stepped inside, the air changed. It was musty, damp, and the faint smell of chemicals lingered. The floors creaked under our feet, and the walls were covered in peeling paint and graffiti from past trespassers. We wandered through the dark hallways, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. At first, it was just a bit of fun, taking pictures, daring each other to explore the creepiest rooms. But then we stumbled upon something that made our blood run cold. In the far corner of the building, we found a room that wasn't on any of the old campus maps. The door was slightly ajar, and inside was what looked like an old laboratory. The equipment was outdated, covered in dust, but what caught our attention was the large metal table in the center of the room. There were restraints on the table, and surrounding it were various surgical tools, some rusted with age. It looked like something out of a horror movie, but this was no movie. This was real. There were files stacked on a nearby desk, yellowed with age. I opened one and my stomach turned. The files detailed experiments conducted on animals, and possibly humans, long after the building was supposed to have been abandoned. The language was clinical, detached, describing procedures that made my skin crawl. Jake, always the brave one, picked up an old tape recorder he found on the desk. To our surprise, it still worked. The tape inside was labeled with nothing but a date, several decades old. We played it, and what we heard chilled us to the bone. The voice on the tape was calm, methodical, describing an experiment in progress. There were sounds in the background, metal clinking, something being dragged, and then screaming. Not loud, but muffled, desperate, like someone trying to cry out but unable to. The recording cut off abruptly, and for a moment, none of us could speak. We looked at each other, the gravity of what we had just uncovered sinking in. This wasn't just an old building. It was a place where terrible things had happened, things that had been buried and forgotten. But the worst part was the realization that whoever had done these things had never been caught, never held accountable. We quickly left the building, our excitement replaced by a deep sense of dread. The next day we tried to report what we had found, but no one believed us. The authorities dismissed it as a prank, a bunch of kids trying to cause trouble. Even when we showed them the files and the tape, they brushed us off, saying it was probably just an old project from years ago, nothing to worry about. But we knew better. We had seen the room, heard the screams. Something terrible had happened in that building, and it had been covered up. After that night, none of us talked about it again. Jake, who had always been the life of the party, became withdrawn, haunted by what we had uncovered. The rest of us went our separate ways trying to forget, but it was impossible. Every time I walk past the site where the building once stood, now just an empty lot, I feel a chill run down my spine. I don't know who was behind those experiments or why they were never caught, but I do know one thing: some secrets are buried for a reason, and sometimes when you dig them up, all you find is darkness. So if you ever find yourself tempted by a dare or the thrill of the unknown, just remember, some doors are better left closed. Story 3. I never thought much of the warnings about my new apartment. I was a second-year college student, broke, and desperate for a place close to campus. The landlord was a strange old man, but the rent was cheap, and that's all that mattered. As he handed me the keys, he gave me a stern look and said, "Stay away from the basement." I laughed it off at the time, thinking it was just some quirk, maybe an old superstition, or a way to keep tenants from wandering where they shouldn't. The first few nights in my new place were uneventful. It wasn't the most comfortable apartment with its creaky floorboards and the musty smell that lingered in the corners, but it was home. At least that's what I kept telling myself. But then, on the fourth night, something changed. I was lying in bed, trying to fall asleep, when I heard a faint noise, almost like crying. At first, I thought I was imagining it or that it was just some weird echo from another apartment. But the more I listened, the more I realized it was real. It was faint, but there was definitely someone crying, and it was coming from beneath the floor. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was probably just a neighbor having a rough night. But the crying didn't stop. Night after night, it grew louder, more desperate. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't concentrate on my studies. The crying was consuming my thoughts. I didn't know what to do. Should I call the police? Report it to the landlord? But what would I even say? On the seventh night, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my phone and a flashlight and decided to investigate. I found myself standing in front of the basement door at the end of a long, dimly lit hallway. My hand shook as I reached for the knob, half expecting it to be locked, but it wasn't. It creaked open, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. As I descended, the smell hit me. Damp earth mixed with something else, something metallic, like rust. The air was thick and cold, and the sound of the crying was clearer now, coming from deep within the basement. I followed it, my heart pounding in my chest, until I reached a small, rusted door at the far end of the room. The crying stopped as soon as I touched the doorknob, replaced by an eerie silence that made my skin crawl. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. But I had to know what was behind that door. I pushed it open slowly, my flashlight flickering as it illuminated the cramped space inside. What I found was horrifying. The room was small, just a few feet wide, with a dirt floor and bare concrete walls. In the corner, chained to the wall, was a woman. She was emaciated, her skin pale and covered in bruises. Her eyes were closed, and she was so still that for a moment I thought she was dead. But then she moved, just slightly, and I saw her chest rise and fall with shallow breaths. I rushed over, fumbling with my phone to call the police. I tried to talk to her, to reassure her that help was coming, but she didn't respond. She just lay there, barely conscious, her body broken and battered from what must have been weeks, if not months, of captivity. The police arrived quickly, and the paramedics took the woman to the hospital. They told me she was in critical condition, but they didn't know if she would survive. As they carried her out, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Her wrists were bruised and bloodied from the chains, but there was something else. Carved into the flesh of her arm was a single word: Maria. I later learned that Maria had been missing for nearly a year. She was a student at a nearby college, just like me, until one day she disappeared without a trace. The landlord, that strange old man, was arrested. It turned out he had a history of violence, but no one ever suspected he could be capable of something like this. He denied everything, of course, but the evidence was overwhelming. They said Maria would never fully recover from the trauma she endured, but she was alive. I never saw her again, but I'll never forget the sound of her crying in the dark. And I'll never forget the landlord's words when he handed me those keys. Stay away from the basement. Story 4. The police worked quickly, combing through the basement for any additional evidence. They took the trunk away, along with the remains, leaving us with a promise to follow up as soon as they knew more. The house, once filled with our laughter and the usual college chatter, now felt like a tomb. We all avoided the basement, even though it had been sealed off with police tape. None of us could shake the feeling that something was still lingering down there, something beyond just the gruesome discovery we had made. A week passed and life attempted to return to normal. Classes, assignments, and the usual college routine took over, but the weight of what we'd found was always there, just beneath the surface. Then, one evening, I received a call from Detective Ramirez, the lead investigator on our case. "We've identified the remains," she said, her voice grave. "It was a young woman, reported missing about 20 years ago. Her name was Emily Saunders. The name meant nothing to me, but the weight of her words did. 20 years? That meant whoever had done this had either been living in the house or had access to it for all that time." Detective Ramirez continued, "We're looking into the previous owners and tenants, but it's slow going. We found some connections to a man who lived there about 15 years ago. He had a history of violence, but we've lost track of him since then." The conversation left me with more questions than answers. Who was this man? Was he still in the area? And why had no one found the body until now? My roommates and I began to feel increasingly uneasy in the house. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of the lights, sent our nerves into overdrive. It was as if the very walls held the memory of what had happened, and it was seeping into our lives. A few days later, we decided we couldn't stay there any longer. The house was cheap, sure, but no amount of savings was worth the constant fear that had taken hold of us. We packed up our things and found another place, leaving the Victorian behind for good. The day we moved out, I caught a glimpse of the basement door, still taped off by the police. It was strange to think that just a few feet below, someone's life had been brutally cut short and hidden away like a dark secret. Months went by, and the investigation eventually faded from the headlines, as these things often do, but the memory never left me. I'd lie awake at night wondering what might have happened if we hadn't found the trunk, if it had stayed buried and forgotten. I also wondered about the man Detective Ramirez had mentioned. Was he out there somewhere, free, while Emily Saunders had been trapped in that dark basement all those years? I later heard that the house had been sold again, this time to someone looking to renovate it and turn it into a bed and breakfast. I couldn't imagine anyone wanting to stay there, knowing what we knew, but I guess people have a way of moving on from things like that. As for me, I never spoke of it again, not to Chris, not to Jason, not to anyone. It was a chapter of my life I was more than happy to close, but every now and then I think about that house, about Emily Saunders, and I wonder what else might still be hiding just out of sight in places we think are safe.